There comes a moment in the life of an empath when silence becomes louder than noise, when pretending to be agreeable becomes a betrayal of the soul, and when saying yes to others becomes a violent no to the self. That moment is not the end of who they are, but the beginning of who they were always meant to be. In the shadows of their people, pleasing, a deeper truth was always whispering. And now they begin to hear it clearly. From the earliest stages of life, the empath unconsciously begins constructing an identity around the expectations and emotional needs of others. As a child, they may have sensed chaos, tension, or emotional instability in the environment, and without knowing how or why, they internalized a sense of responsibility for keeping the peace, not through dominance, but through compliance. Not by demanding attention, but by dissolving themselves so completely that no one would ever be upset with them. In doing so, they unknowingly made a pact with their own unconscious to be loved. I must not disturb, to be safe, I must serve. This becomes the quiet foundation of their personality, the invisible script they follow well into adulthood. Every smile that hides discomfort, every nod that swallows dissent, every act of kindness offered out of fear rather than freedom, deepens the groove of this survival pattern. The world around them applauds their selflessness, their willingness to help, their radiant compassion, but this praise masks a tragic irony. The more they give away their energy to earn love, the further they drift from themselves. The more agreeable they become, the less they are allowed to have needs of their own. The more they smooth over conflict, the more conflict they internalize within their own psyche. Pleasing others, for the empath, is not merely a choice. It becomes a compulsion, a spiritual addiction to harmony, even when it costs them their health, their truth, their vitality. They become so hyper, attuned to the moods, expectations, and emotions of others that they can no longer locate their own inner voice. Their intuitive gifts, which were meant to guide them, become hijacked by the needs of those around them. Their empathy, which should have been a bridge to connection, becomes a trapdoor to exploitation. And the tragedy is not that the empath gives too much, but that they often give to those who do not know how to receive, who only know how to take. This sets up a cycle of emotional depletion, where the empath feels responsible for healing wounds that are not theirs, resolving problems they did not cause, and making people happy at the expense of their own inner peace. It's not that they do not sense their own exhaustion or recognize the quiet resentment growing inside. It's that they feel guilty for noticing it. They've been taught that to feel burdened by giving means they are selfish, ungrateful, or unkind. And so they continue, they overextend, they over-apologize, they overcompensate, they say yes while their gut screams no, they offer patience while their spirit trembles in fatigue, they love where there is no love in return. And still, they blame themselves for not being enough. This psychological distortion is not a result of weakness, but of deep psychological conditioning. The empath often carries unconscious beliefs that their worth is tied to usefulness, that love must be earned through sacrifice, that their pain is less important than another's comfort. These beliefs become entrenched over time, reinforced by relationships that benefit from their silence. Partners, friends, even family members may come to expect their endless giving, their emotional labor, their ability to absorb toxicity without complaint. The empath becomes the emotional container for everyone else's dysfunction, the sponge that soaks up all the negativity so that others can remain dry. But there comes a moment when the container cracks, when the sponge becomes saturated, when the soul begins to rebel in quiet, strange ways, fatigue that won't go away, anxiety that surfaces without cause, sadness that clings to the bones even on good days. These symptoms are not failures, they are signals. They are the psyche's way of saying enough. They are truth knocking on the door of the self, asking to be let in. Because beneath the pleasing, beneath the masks of agreeability, there lives a deeper voice, a voice that remembers who they were before they were told who they had to be. This voice does not shout, it whispers. It stirs late at night when the world is quiet and the roles have been put down. It questions the patterns that once seemed necessary. It wonders what life would feel like if love did not have to be earned. It begins to ask, what do I want? Not just what do others want from me. Who am I without the caretaking, without the apology, without the fear? These questions do not come easily, and they are not welcomed by the parts of the empath still clinging to the old script. But once the questions start, they do not stop. They spread through the inner world like light through cracks in a wall. They reveal the cost of the performance. They reveal the emptiness of relationships built on obligation rather than authenticity. They reveal the aching desire to finally rest, not just physically, but spiritually, to be loved not for what they do, but for who they are when they do nothing, to be seen not as the helper, the healer, the listener, the fixer, but as a whole being with needs, with flaws, with limits. This moment of revelation is not dramatic, but it is revolutionary. It is the beginning of a shift from external validation to internal alignment, from survival to sovereignty, from suppression to self-expression, from pleasing to presence, from being the peacekeeper to becoming the truth teller, from giving in fear to loving in freedom. And once this shift begins, there is no going back. The moment the empath begins to question, their role is often quiet and subtle, not marked by grand gestures or explosive decisions, but by small internal shifts that ripple through their psyche like tremors before a quake. They may find themselves hesitating before giving that automatic yes, or catching a strange discomfort when a familiar pattern of emotional giving arises. It's as though their spirit begins to resist the habitual urge to rescue, to comfort, to mediate. They notice how certain people grow distant when they say no for the first time, how silence falls heavy when they dare to express disappointment, how those who claim to care withdraw their affection the moment the empath asserts a boundary. These moments sting, not only because they expose the conditional nature of these relationships, but because they force the empath to confront a painful truth. They were loved for what they provided, not for who they are. It is in these moments that the illusion begins to shatter. The roles they played so diligently begin to feel hollow. The peace they worked so hard to maintain begins to feel more like suppression. The validation they once craved begins to taste bitter. This is the awakening, not of rebellion, but of realization. The empath begins to see patterns they were once too blinded by fear to acknowledge. They begin to trace the outlines of manipulation dressed as affection, of guilt disguised as love, of control masked as concern. They see the double standards, the one-sided loyalty, the emotional withdrawals that occurred every time they deviated from expectation. This new sight is not easy to hold. It does not bring relief at first. It brings grief. A profound mourning begins for the years spent trying to earn love, for the identity built around other people's comfort, for the needs they silence to keep others close. The empath does not rise from this grief with anger, but with clarity. And clarity, in its rawest form, is a kind of purification. It cleanses the fog of self, doubt, the confusion of mixed signals, the tangled threads of emotional dependency that once held them captive. They begin to understand that their kindness was not always met with kindness, that their compassion was not always reciprocated, that their empathy had been used as a currency by those who never intended to give anything back. This realization stirs something powerful inside, the beginning of inner authority. No longer willing to be a reflection of others' needs, the empath starts to seek the truth of their own essence. This is not a movement toward selfishness, but toward self-ownership. They begin to ask questions they never had permission to ask before. What if saying no is an act of love? What if walking away is not weakness, but wisdom? What if the people who leave when I stop pleasing were never really present in the first place? These questions unearth long, buried instincts. The empath begins to remember that intuition is not only about sensing others, it is also about sensing what is not right for the self. They start to trust the discomfort they once dismissed. That knot in the stomach, that fatigue after certain conversations, that dread before seeing a particular person, these sensations, once rationalized away, are now honored as messages, and in honoring them, the empath begins to shift their entire orientation toward life. No longer do they see themselves as responsible for everyone's emotions. No longer do they feel guilty for choosing themselves. They begin to understand that true compassion includes the self, that real connection cannot exist where truth is not welcome, that love without freedom is not love, but dependency. This internal transformation does not make the empath cold or distant. Rather, it makes their love more intentional. They no longer offer energy out of obligation. They no longer confuse exhaustion with generosity. They no longer entertain relationships that require self-betrayal. As they remove themselves from dynamics built on performance and people-pleasing, they create space for solitude, for healing, for reflection, and in that sacred space, something unexpected happens. They begin to feel a deep, unfamiliar stillness. A sense of self not defined by what others need from them, but by what they need to feel whole. They begin to hear their own voice, faint at first, but unmistakable. A voice that says, "You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to be whole even if others are uncomfortable with your boundaries." This voice becomes a steady rhythm in their life, guiding their decisions, shaping their interactions, protecting their energy. Though this path is not without loss, the empath discovers that what they lose in approval, they gain in alignment. They no longer seek to belong where their soul is not safe. They no longer interpret rejection as a reflection of their worth. They begin to recognize that not every relationship deserves access to their light, that not everyone is meant to walk with them in this new chapter, and this realization brings an unexpected peace, the kind of peace that does not come from avoiding conflict, but from living in truth. The empath begins to embody a different kind of power, not loud, not aggressive, but rooted, sovereign, unshakable. They learn to hold their ground without apology. They learn to listen to others without abandoning their own voice. They learn that love, when real, does not demand sacrifice of the self, and as they move forward, they carry this truth with them like armor, like medicine, like a compass that never again points them away from who they are as the empath releases the compulsive need to please and finally stands in the truth of their own being. An inner shift begins that is not just emotional or mental, but existential. This shift is not marked by grand declarations, but by a quiet certainty that they are no longer available for roles that diminish them, relationships that drain them, or expectations that silence them. In this sacred transition, the empath is no longer seeking validation from the outside, but instead begins to anchor into the core of their soul. And this anchoring allows them to reclaim aspects of themselves that were long ago exiled in the name of harmony. They start to retrieve their intuition, not just as a tool for sensing others, but as a compass that reveals their own needs, their own rhythms, their own desires. They begin to feel what is aligned and what is not through logic or persuasion, but through the body's silent wisdom, the way their breath shortens around dishonesty, the way their heart expands in the presence of authenticity, the way their spirit calms when they finally stop apologizing for existing. The empath who no longer sacrifices truth for acceptance enters a new kind of maturity, a psychological sovereignty that cannot be manipulated with guilt or obligation, and this sovereignty is not loud, it is not boastful, it is still, grounded, elemental. It shows up in small decisions, not replying to a message that reeks of emotional entitlement, leaving a room when the energy becomes toxic, choosing solitude over forced connection, trusting the silence instead of rushing to fill it, no longer defending their choices to those who have already decided not to understand them. Each of these actions, though simple, is revolutionary because they mark the empath's return to inner authority, the sacred knowing that they no longer owe anyone their peace in exchange for momentary approval. And with this, the empath stops seeing themselves as broken or too sensitive and begins to recognize that their depth, once exploited, is a rare form of intelligence that must be guarded with intention. They begin to understand that energy is not infinite and that to give it indiscriminately is a betrayal of self-respect. They begin to discern the difference between support and self-sacrifice, between compassion and codependence, between forgiveness and self-abandonment. They no longer rush to explain themselves to those committed to misunderstanding, nor do they contort themselves to be digestible for others' egos. Instead, they begin to align with relationships that offer mutual nourishment, spaces where their truth is not merely tolerated but celebrated, dynamics where their silence is not interpreted as weakness but honored as introspection. These connections may be fewer, but they are deeper, and they do not require performance or pretense. They allow the empath to rest, to breathe, to just be. And in this space of self-recognition, the empath discovers a paradox. The more they protect their energy, the more powerfully their light shines, because now their giving is no longer a survival strategy. It is a choice born from fullness, not from fear. They offer kindness without expecting it to be currency. They offer love without using it as a hook to gain approval. They offer presence because they want to, not because they must. And this difference changes everything. Their yes becomes a sacred contract. Their no becomes an act of liberation. Their silence becomes an act of wisdom. They move through life with a kind of quiet conviction, knowing that they are no longer defined by how others see them, but by how aligned they feel within themselves. There is a strength in this that no one can take from them, because it is not built on the unstable ground of others' moods, but on the deep foundation of inner clarity. This clarity becomes their shield, not from love but from distortion, not from connection but from corruption. It allows them to see manipulation where they once saw love. It allows them to identify projection where they once took blame. It allows them to trust their perceptions, even when others gaslight them into doubt. This is the empath fully initiated into self-trust, and with that comes a new kind of presence, fierce yet gentle, open yet discerning, loving yet uncompromising. They no longer chase anyone. They no longer try to fix what they didn't break. They no longer measure their worth by how much they can endure. Instead, they create space for joy, for healing, for curiosity, for truth. They begin to nurture the parts of themselves they had long neglected, their creativity, their rest, their sensuality, their desires, their boundaries, their wildness. The world may not always understand this version of the empath. Some will accuse them of changing, of becoming distant, of not being who they used to be, and in a way that is true. They are no longer who they were when they were disconnected from themselves. But this change is not a betrayal of their essence. It is the return to it. They are not less loving, they are simply loving themselves too. They are not less available, they are just no longer accessible to those who feed on their light without ever offering their own. They are not cold, they are clear. They are not selfish, they are sovereign. And in this sovereignty, they find a peace that is not dependent on the external, a joy that is not performative, a freedom that is not given but reclaimed. So they walk differently now, not with the weight of others' expectations on their shoulders, but with the ease of someone who has remembered they were never here to be consumed, but to live fully, deeply, honestly, and freely. They no longer fit into the roles others assigned to them, and that is not their failure. it is their liberation. They are not who they were, and they will not apologize for it, because in finally seeing the truth, they have found something worth more than approval. They have found themselves the empath who stops pleasing everyone, does not become less loving. They become more truthful. They return to themselves, no longer apologizing for existing, no longer performing for peace. They walk through life not trying to be enough for others, but being whole for themselves. And from that wholeness, they love more deeply, live more authentically, and see more clearly. This is not the fall of the empath, this is their rising. Ask ChatGPT.